The hunch we've had is like, maybe actually the context that was written like a year ago, when it was like Cursor, Sonnet 3.5, it is still relevant today. And so we started to look into it, and then we're like, well, what if we delete the whole context from the repo? Like, what would happen? And what happened for us is actually like the evals started to perform like much better, which was counterintuitive, but it's just like, yeah, that file was pretty big and was listing stuff that was not like necessarily useful. And so that was really interesting to see.
The AI Native Dev is a podcast for developers and engineering leads at the cutting edge of AI and agentic coding. Join your hosts, Guy Pajani and me, Simon Maple, every week as we chat with the most exciting voices in AI and tackle the biggest questions facing developers today. This is the AI Native Dev. We just wrapped up 2 amazing days at AI DevCon in London.
But the great thing is that we get to do it all over again in New York City this November.
You're absolutely right. We're going to be back in the city that never sleeps on November 3rd and 4th for more amazing sessions, really engaging hands-on workshops, and much more.
Yep, all that great networking, partying, eating and drinking that you've come to expect from AI DevCon. We think we have one of the best hallway tracks in the business, and it's the perfect complement to our incredible speakers and presenters.
We'll both be in person and virtual with live-streamed access to all main stage keynotes and talks.
Sign up right now for our super blind bird ticket for just $100, only available for a limited time.
We're really excited to be headed back to the Big Apple. We hope to see you all there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AI Native Dev podcast. Today, we have a really interesting story about how to build out agent enablement and learn from it, looking at Datadog as an organization that really kind of dove in and invested in agent enablement and has a bunch of learnings to tell from the journey. And to guide us through all of that is Simon Boudrias. I hope I'm not sort of mispronounced that too badly. Simon, thanks for coming on to the show.
My pleasure. So,
Simon, we're going to do this justice and sort of go in chronological order on it, but just to sort of give people a little bit of a teaser of some of the highlights I know in the as we talked through the journey that I really liked. We'll talk a little bit about context, but actually a fair bit about context. Where did it work for you when you created it? Where did it create kind of context rot and exaggeration? And I don't know if it's dramatic or standard case, but a learning about cases where an eval showed you that if you deleted all the context, it actually did better than before. So that'll be great. We'll talk a little bit about org and how do you structure and who owns what, the importance of evals, and we'll talk about where the bottleneck is. What are the problems really that are worth solving, because there's infinite work in the world of where we're doing it. So I'm keen to share all of these stories. For starters, can you just sort of tell us a little bit about what is it that you do, kind of the scope of responsibilities, and maybe a couple of words about Datadog and the large group of engineers that you're trying to sort of optimize their work for here?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a director at Datadog. I manage a part of the SDLC org. We're called for the language foundations. And so we are serving about 4,000 engineers here at Datadog. And the way that I've described our scope is like basically kind of the front end of the SDLC. It's like everything people interact with day to day and like how they do their work. A lot of that falls within my group. And a year ago now, we launched like a new AI DevX group to focus on AI tooling basically here at Datadog.
Yeah, that little sort of a small initiative there of, maybe this thing has legs on it. Cool. Okay. And I like the definition of like the front end of the sort of the developer tools on it. I guess when you have 4,000 developers, there's a depth to that as well. So walk us through a little bit of the storyline of, as you started to invest centrally or in general, like how did the kind of engineering organization and Datadog kind of approach or start opening up the use of agents, and a little bit of that timeline of how it evolved to today?
Yeah. So like for us, it really started in the beginning of like 2025, when vibe coding as a term was like coined. There was much more talk about it, about this being viable and like starting to be something that like really we could use AI to write code. And so it's like for us, the big driver there has been Cursor at the beginning. And so at the beginning of 2025, we launched like a POC internally with like Cursor. Initially, we were aiming to, get like 100, maybe 200 devs to use Cursor and just like get some signals of like how like it worked for them. And it just like took off from there. Like we had so many more than like 200 people. We quickly had like 1,000 devs using Cursor almost day to day within like kind of a month of like launching for this POC. And so like for us, it was a pretty big signal that like, yeah, there's truly something there. There was a lot of people that like liked it, fully like value in it.
This is pure pull, right? Like you're just like, you opened the door, you said you can use Cursor, and everybody came running in.
Correct. Everybody wanted to get in and like try it out, basically. And so that's where we started. And like with like that pull, towards more AI tool, we were like, well, yeah, this is going to be transformational to this industry and like how we do our work as engineer. And so at that point, we decided to, okay, well, we will probably need to like create kind of a team to like own those tools and like own for the experience around AI used for development. And so at that time, we started to recruit a team that pretty went through like kind of the whole summer. And before the recruitment of the team, the sort of the we over here is basically you and the people looking at like developer experience and front end are the people, I guess, before it was designated AI. Yeah, correct. It was like folks within my org. We ran for the piece. It was a staff engineer, Mael, who like took for the shepherdship of that of the Cursor POC.
Yeah, and I liked how you sort of told me that at some point this was demand was so kind of off the list that you had a product manager that found themselves manually, because like you weren't ready for the avalanche, and so someone was like manually adding people's emails in to sort of add them to the Cursor list of cloud users.
Yeah. That was with like Claude Code over the summer. When like Claude came out, like there was a second wave of adoption, and like that tool. So at first we had issue to set up for the SSO. I'm not like exactly sure why, but that didn't work. And so we needed to add manual email to Claude Code basically to get access to people. And yeah, a PM took that role of like basically managing access to that tool over the summer until we could figure out the SSO bug we were running into.
Somewhat ironic in the sort of the era of AI. So sorry, I kind of disrupted your flow though a little bit. I love that story too much. So you had Cursor, you decided to hire someone, and then you went on to start Claude Code. I guess, how did Claude Code enter the scene here? Yeah,
so because the product we were already working with the Anthropic models, we had connection already in like a contract, and so just like someday Claude Code came out, and people could basically use it because we had API keys. And so yeah, it just was available overnight. And I think, people pay kind of attention to like the news cycle, what like people are like saying, and there was a lot of hype around Claude Code at that time. And so it basically organically grew from that point.
Would you say like the Claude Code adoption, this is history at this point, versus present, but would you say Claude Code adoption was as fast as the Cursor one? Because Cursor, they really nailed the kind of low friction. You're already in the IDE, will give you superpowers, so why wouldn't you want Cursor? While Claude Code was more, like more of a big change to it, that clearly super compelling, but still the appeal was the same, or was Cursor still adopted faster?
That is hard to say. I'm not sure. It's like both at that point, towards the end of the summer of like 2025, because I think the story changed later. But at that point, they pretty similar, and I think they were catering to like different personas. It's like people, especially for us, where maybe piece of context, like we have huge monorepos. And so we know like VS Code on those tends to perform pretty badly. And so the base of Cursor in some of our monorepos was causing issue for adoption of just like being not performant enough for the large repos we're having. And so there was like some of those people had a much better kind of experience with Claude Code running in a terminal, where like you don't need to have the whole IDE running. And so for a lot of people, that was more compelling, I think, just from like a performance reason. And so I think like that drove a lot of people there. And then all of our power user quickly flipped over to Claude Code, because I think what they were seeing is like they don't need the IDE open. They could do most of their work without an IDE open. And so for them, that adoption for the power user was like pretty clear early on.
Got it. Yeah. And so we're about a year ago, we're sort of like approaching summer of 25 at this point. Okay. So talk us through. So cool. So you had a Cursor just sort of lumped in, you decided to hire. While you're hiring, you sort of have this sort of Claude Code, land in your lap, and you're managing sort of added, with that sort of SSO. And then you said you started to build a team.
Yeah. We started to build a team. So like one of our early champion was an EM here at Datadog. We offered them to do kind of a team switch and like build this new team. We started to recruit people for that team. We had a few transfer come in as well. And so we like started to put that team together. We wanted to do everything, but you got to decide where you start. And so for that team, initially, we started really like focus on like metrics and just getting more metrics into like what is going on, what is the impact, what is the cost as well. And on the other side, we knew already that like AI was pretty expensive. And so we wanted to start to be able to like benchmark different models. What is the best solution? And so we created a team, or like that team started to work on evals and like building kind of a agentic coding tool, eval platform, to help us make decision, about like which model, which tool we should onboard at Datadog.
And this is like an early embrace of evals, which I appreciate. We're sort of big fans here at Tessel. And how did you apply that? So like, what are examples of things that you eval? We'll dive in more. So I'm still in like journey mode, but in these sort of earlier days, it was sometimes hard. Like you might draw a conclusion from an eval, but it's not always easy to think about how would you apply that learning. So what are examples of like, should we do X that you've decided?
Yeah. So I'd say like the first application of evals for us very concretely was for code review. And we had a bit of back and forth on like, what's the value of AI in code review? And I think, if you work with a tool that is very nitpicky, it's not really fun to work with a nitpicker that is not human. And so we saw pretty early on that like, really for us, the distinction here would be like, we wanted to put AI in the loop for code review to really like prevent an incident or like kind of major bug and like really like focus on that, as like kind of the last guardrail before you go to production. And so the first evals we did was like replaying PRs we knew had caused incident and then like catching, are they going to figure out that this is going to fail actually? And so, we do track a lot of data around incidents here at Datadog in a data set. And so we had all that data already kind of there for the picking. And so we were able from there to like devise and like kind of basically build a platform that would replay PRs and then run the whole agentic review. And then with an agent judge being like, well, does that review comment point out what is going to cause an incident later on?
Yeah, super smart because it's like a clear use case because in evals oftentimes the difficulty is defining what correct is, but if you have those historical incidents. So I want to dig into evals, but let's just sort of complete maybe the timeline. So you went ahead, you sort of hired or like moved this internal person and you started building a team. And I know, maybe fast forwarding to today, as that team evolved, you now have two teams, right? Like now that you're sort of a bit more mature, maybe tell us a little bit about current setup and then we'll move on to evals.
Yeah. So what it says, like we had a lot of ambition, around like changing the way we work with AI. But towards the beginning of the year, what we saw is like that first team that we built, they had a ton on their plate with evals, with metrics, with like cost management, and all of that. And so it was really hard to then like, carve out a piece of, time for us to actually work on like rethinking how we work And at the same time, at the beginning of the year, I think everybody saw with Opus 4.5 that came out just before the holidays, that like adoption from there really like took off like really, really fast. You know, probably everybody says like the amount of like PR pretty much doubled overnight, you know?
Yeah.
And it started to really show, you know, kind of bottlenecks in our flow in the SDLC that are way more serious than they were before. And then it was hard to carve out time to actually like focus on that. Namely for us right now, it's like really code review is like pretty like the big bottleneck that we're trying to tackle. And at that point, we're like, well, we need more people to work and like really focus on the experience itself of like, you know, the SDLC with AI, and not just more kind of the governance and like signals side of the world. And so we like launched like a second team. I forgot exactly when, but towards the beginning of the year.
Yeah, no, very cool. I love that. And I like the names you sort of mentioned to them as well, which is Signal and Flow. It's like very, that's what it says on the tin type names. And just, I guess, for it's useful sometimes as people calibrate for them to sort of think about rough sizes of those teams. Like it's kind of, you have circa 4,000 engineers in total. What is sort of the rough sizes of these two teams?
Yeah. So we're aiming to have around six people in like kind of both team, and we're still recruiting for that second team.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, well, that's still a good ratio, you know, in terms of multiplications and leverage.
Yeah. So about 12 people for 4,000 engineers.
Yeah. And I guess as the organization flows, this may be like one last question on the team thing before we continue. As you change the way that you work and the adaptation, did a need for new signals come out? Like, because I think the previous team, like the signal team, is very much around current way of working. Let's sort of measure output so we see if productivity improves or, you know, costs change, etc. But now that you change it, did you find the same metrics work over time, or did you need to kind of invent new metrics, or sort of start measuring new things?
Yeah. So I don't think we've had to change dramatically how we measure, you know, productivity. But I'd say like we're using a lot like DORA metrics, and these tends to be more, they're not like leading metrics, they're a lagging metric. And so looking more into like the leading metrics and like what in there, I think usually we need a bit more creativity, and those are usually kind of less like true signals, are like they're a piece of the pie, and it's hard to isolate exactly what moved those metrics. So like what I'd say, maybe like what has been more visible is more like how we think of cost and like the amount of like token we're using. And then, so like, just like being more professional and like handling cost of AI, like, with now everybody at the company basically using AI, using more of it, there's a bit, it does increase for the budget that goes towards AI. And so like, we just need to be more cognizant of this and just make sure that this use reasonable. And so definitely more on the cost aspect of it that we've done. And then the other thing is like with evals, and now that we're getting a bit more data, then like the question comes on like, well, how like do you turn that into action, or like to know what to do with the evals? And so it's like probably like those two aspects had changed more. In terms of productivity metrics themselves, we're still mainly looking at like DORA metrics overall to get signals.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, makes sense. And I guess, did you ever get into token maxing of it, or has that been, because you mentioned cost, like you're sort of aware of how much it cost before. That sounds a little bit counter, like I want this successful, but I want it responsibly successful.
Mm-hmm. No, not like token maxing. We never did quotas, for example. And so we're trying to like really not go that route, because, if you need a lot of token because of what you're working on, we kind of do want people to have the optionality, and be intentional about for their own use and their own needs. And so, it's like maybe a bit like breathing hot and cold at the same time. But we're really more looking into like systematic way that we can
Cool.
reduce token or like compress output, things like that.
Cool. Cool. Okay. Thanks for sort of the rundown there, sort of on the team who've done it. We've started sort of teasing out a little bit this sort of investment in evals, and creating it. And I thought that was really interesting because this is very much like a world of vibes, right? I'd say even until today, evals, like if you're building an AI product, everybody will say evals. But if you are talking about sort of development with agents, or if you're talking about even sort of like agentic workflows as a whole, I guess kind of showing my bias a little bit is like I feel like there's a lack of it there. Like the vibes are quite dominant on it. And so I like that you kind of created those. Can you tell us a little bit about like what works? So like you've invested in evals. We don't really need to go through the whole journey of, but like where you are today, what is it that you do today with evals? Maybe tell us a little bit about the tech stack, but also what is the value that you sort of derive out of them, and maybe where are they not in yet?
Yeah. Okay. So like for us, it's a fully custom solution written in Go with like sandboxing. So I don't know, when we started, if there was a lot of open source option, we pretty like looked at a few, but nothing was like really mature. And so like we just went our own way, since like it was not like overly complex for a pure use case of like AI agent. And then Datadog has a pretty good metric platform. So like it was easy to just feed the metrics in there and then consume it from Datadog directly. So in terms of like what we do today with the evals, there's like mainly like two things that we're looking at really specifically. On one side, it's like just like tracking performance of like new models, especially for the open weight model, and like trying to get a sense of like when could that be a viable alternative, or in which fashion could they be. And on the other side is like, how does the things like steering documents, are they working? When we change it, does it change the performance of the evals? And so like really more on the performance side, where like teams that are not us are going to own steering documents, or maybe should own the steering documents, because we can talk of ownership there sometimes is a bit hard within repositories. And just like tracking a bit the performance on like, is there an issue, and like, should we change it, and in which form should we change them?
And did you, maybe there's like two different sort of conversations here. Sorry, I started both together there. Maybe one is like, let's talk a little bit about the stack, and then we go to the substance. So on the stack, you built your own because, you have your sort of Datadog platform, kind of clearly very good at collecting data, and aggregating it. And I guess at the time, nothing else was mature. Do you think people should build their own eval system? Or would you say, like, if you were to do this again today, you'd probably pick Harbor or sort of one of the existing frameworks for it? Or do you think that there's sort of aspects of how you do the eval that you feel like they need to be custom, they need to be yours?
Yeah, so I don't feel like strongly about custom versus hosted platform. I think what's important is like to be able to support multiple harnesses, multiple models from like different source. I think it's pretty important. But as long as you have that, then I think like most of the platform do offer it. I think going with like an off-the-shelf solution is pretty good. But I'd say also coding being less of an issue today, for us it's been fairly easy to put it together.
It wasn't that hard. Yeah. To build the system. So I guess so I think that sort of makes sense. Like technically, just to be able to run an agent and sort of have a card or like some sort of scorecard and run that and aggregate the data. Those are kind of within core competencies, and I guess you kind of always weigh that a little bit against. Okay, but why reinvent it? Like if it's not that custom. So it's a decision I guess all developers are sort of fairly familiar with. The second question that I have is maybe a bit more in the substance. Is at the beginning you talked about use cases that made a lot of sense, that are central and have clarity about what the truth is. So I guess my question is, as you approach use cases that are sort of more elaborate and you talk about using models and all that, like what is correct is not always as clear cut. So I guess how do you handle that, and maybe like who even writes that down, today, right? Like who creates the eval scenarios?
Yeah. So in terms of evals and like writing those evals, there's a few different things that we're doing and like new stuff that we're trying out now. The status quo so far has been we've wrote the first ones with like very common use case to just like have a baseline that we can go through. And then we went out to pretty much like all of the platform teams and like asked them to like add evals, to like cover their like own platform use. And so really spread out for the ownership of those evals across the company and just like get more support. The downside of that though, is that, it is limited in a way of like, if as a dev you're using like a harness or like an agentic tool, like you're probably not only asking them to do very specific things. There's a lot of the work that's more on the creative side, finding ideas. What should you do? What's the right approach to your problem? This we don't try to cover with the evals we have, because it's just like so broad that it's just like really hard to know what exactly should you try. And if it's always the same question, then like you only have this like a small slice. But like kind of the creativity aspect, I think is somewhere, or like something that's like really hard to gauge with an agent. Right. And so I don't have a great answer to that, but I know it's a hole that we're having, and we're like fine to live with this gap that we're not sure how to fill yet. Maybe someday I can come back and like maybe we figure it out. But for now, we're not too much trying to like tackle that.
Right. So you, just to sort of echo back over here, you're saying at the moment where you're sort of seeing the value in a bit of a concrete fashion is in finding cases that have clarity about truth. They're repeatable processes. You're doing the thing again and again. And generally the scenarios and all that are written fairly centrally, like not just by you, but by, you mentioned platform teams. So like it's not going to the end developers. They're not really writing evals. No. These are extractions out of real world scenarios of evals that change at a slightly lower pace, broadly speaking. And do you think eventually, like if you were kind of a betting man, right, and you'd sort of say in a year's time, do you think all developers write evals, or do you think it stays this way? This is like a crystal ball question, so I'm not going to hold you to it. But.
No, but I have a good answer for you here. I don't think every dev is going to be writing evals. Though what we're doing right now, so TBD if it's going to work, but I'm pretty confident that it's going to be the right solution for us going forward. We are tracking for the trajectories of agents and what they're doing. And so we're tracking a lot of data today for the use of agent within Datadog. And so what we want to do is like go from that to raw data of like, this prompt came in, the agent did that, etc., and like extract from there common scenarios that tend to recur, or like common type of interaction that a user have with a given platform, and then using an agent to turn that into actual eval. And so basically taking like real data of like how people use the agents and make sure that we're covering, a fair amount of overlap with actual use. Yeah. And we're pretty confident that we can automate most of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. And that is actually very aligned with sort of our experience at Tesla, which is the more you anchor it in concrete cases, the more real it is. And then, what do developers not like doing? They don't like writing docs. They don't like writing tests. And so now you're sort of saying, hey, write docs and tests. That doesn't really work. And so probably the best ease of use aspect to it is, instead of asking devs to write those tests or write those eval scenarios, you observe them. You sort of extract them out of the loop, and you extract these scenarios. I guess there is an unavoidable future or sort of evolution to that you will still need. Like, these things are dynamic, and so you still captured that scenario, that sort of hypothetical aggregate PR. At least that's the case in our world, right? You've observed a bunch of PRs, you've created an eval scenario, you're running it, you're still capturing that as some files that sit in some repo. And over time, it will rot, right? Like over time, it will no longer represent your system. And so there has to be some maintenance. So at some point, someone needs to own that, right? Like, and that someone is hopefully someone who can kind of represent developing in this repo, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. But I think it just, it's hard to catch rot, and it's hard to come back to like case you created in the past, because like the amount usually that you end up with is like fairly large. And so we're really focused on automation here. So like really having an agents to do for the sweeping, at the very least bring up the signal, but eventually maybe even make the decision about like which cases are still relevant today.
Yeah. I think I buy into that. I think in general, like whenever you introduce a human, you create a bottleneck. We'll talk about that in a sec. But whenever you introduce a human, and so you have to plan ahead for this. And in that sense, the users, both the authors and the users of the evals, are very likely to be agents. So you still need to create them, but it's not necessarily the person that creates it. Might be someone else. And I guess before we kind of move on a little bit from evals on it, how often do you run the evals? So like once you agree that something is correct, is this something you deem after the fact? Do you run them on every context change? Do you run them? I guess, how does the execution of the evals integrate into this SDLC?
Yeah. So today we're doing nightly evals. So we're running basically once a day. And then for PR, that might specifically target evals, like they're changing steering documents in like a heavy way, really trying to like change for the results. For those people who can do like a ad hoc run. And they're probably going to want to do a few, since like evals are not always super stable to get a statistical significant results.
Got it. Very cool. So this is, you run nightly, you look at relevant changes, some steering docs that have sort of modified. If those occurred, you run the eval. Even if there's an apparent regression, you point that out to the person. So you don't get in the way, and you run them. I guess it's sort of consistent with the previous theme, which is you run them on the things that you feel like you truly know, as opposed to trying to speculatively anticipate ahead.
Correct.
Okay. And that probably results in something that, like, costs-wise, is not that big a deal. I don't know, how expensive are these evals getting?
It's a good question. I'm not sure, but evals are expensive.
Like they're cheap enough that they haven't doubled your sort of
I don't know.
Right?
Compared to the coding agent use, it is it is nothing compared to, but it's definitely something that we're cognizant of, and like the decision to run it nightly is obviously part of that. We're like, well, if we run per PR, obviously it's that is going to be too expensive.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been experimenting with this, of course, sort of in Tesla, like Tesla itself, but also kind of with customers. And the one of the observations is that you can actually use cheap models, like cheap open models, to assess regressions. So we found that DeepSeek actually correlates pretty well in terms of the skill uplift for a variety of tasks. And so what you can do is, it doesn't need to be as good at overall the tasks, but if you measure it with the skill, now that one is like it's fast and it's cheap. And so maybe you can run that sort of DeepSeek V4 Flash as part of your CI test for some sort of selection. And so you find it, because it has all the sort of the natural problem of, if someone made a change yesterday and you're coming back to them tomorrow, it's annoying, it's rework. It's better if it's in line. Have to weigh that. So I don't know precisely where it lands, but I feel like there is an evolution of evals expanding as tests, right? Just like we have some tests that we run in the CI and some tests that are too expensive or slow to run in the CI. I think we'll have the same for evals.
I think that is exactly correct. And it's also the way we're thinking about it, right? Like what you can run after the fact, and like, what's like the cost of a revert or like a rollback versus the cost of like that, like you pay now waiting before you can merge something. And so it's not always a clear trade-off. But we need to try to be cognizant of the cost of making a mistake versus the cost of waiting for things to run or paying for the infra to run it.
Yeah, exactly. Very cool. Okay, cool. So I love the passion about evals, and I can kind of geek out about evals. I've built a passion for them. But let's talk a little bit about context. So in the process of that, you referred here to sort of steering context and all that. What is the sort of the state of context typically within Datadog? Are people is there a central context that people share it? Is it mostly in repo? Like, how would you describe like skill adoption right now? Give us a bit of a picture of where is context being used. Focus on dev within the organization. Yeah.
So it's like there's like two big sources. One is files that are just committed to the repositories themselves. I'd say like skills is now mainly what there is. There's not a lot of other stuff that is not skills. Skills is has been pretty well adopted. And then we have the cloud marketplace with a lot of skills there as well. That is centralized. And I can talk of like mistakes and like all of those as well if you're
Yeah,
interested.
let's sort of talk. I think you had multiple sort of insights. So
Yeah. So
where did it work? Let's start positive. Where do you sort of see it working?
Yeah. So I mean, what worked really well is like everybody contributed early on, and especially when we started, without a central team, it was like a POC, just like get people onboarded. I think it was good to not put too much structure early on, so we can try and see what worked and like have learnings out of it. And so I think for the barrier and the friction early on was like really low, and I think that was probably the right move to do. Because we want people to be contributing and we want the best idea to win and those ideas to be easy to share.
Yeah, I love that. The kind of core principle about transformation is at the beginning you're trying to drive adoption, not efficiency.
Yeah.
Just sort of get people in the boat.
Absolutely. But then what we saw through time is the more user we've had, the harder it became to go and like change them. Because the impact you're having then, instead of like being on like 200 people doing kind of a POC with you, like using for the same tool, you're going to impact like 4,000 people working on the repository. And so like, it's just like much more stressful to like break things for like so many people. And then also the size became kind of hard to manage. Like kind of the Claude marketplace has hundreds of plugins. So, once you install the marketplace, like, do you know which plugins are good? Which one should you use? Which one are going to perform better? And so what we've steered people to do is more team-based marketplace for them to share for their own flows within the team, things that are specific to their team, or marketplaces extension for specific platforms. So if you work with platform X, well, we will suggest in the documentation that you install that marketplace and those plugins for you. Or we'll refer to it, from context document where the agent can suggest to install a marketplace and stuff like that.
Yeah, very interesting. So like groups of context so people know where they're approaching that and they control that.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of slightly hinders maybe like reusability. You might sort of have different teams. You probably do have different teams that do that, but you slightly control the chaos in this fashion.
Yeah. Correct. And then what I'd say we found out at the beginning of the year, Pi became like pretty popular recently. And so we saw many people like starting to hint at like the fact that like Pi somehow was just performing better than the alternative we had. And like,
to clarify for those who don't know, that Pi is the kind of very highly customizable custom harness that is open source, but then you can customize on top of which OpenClaw is built.
Exactly. And so one thing is like by default, it's not going to read a lot of the context. And so kind of the hunch we've had is like maybe actually the context that was written like a year ago, when it was like Cursor, Sonnet 3.5, it is still relevant today in the world of Opus 4.8, of GPT 5.5, right? Like, maybe not. And so we started to look into it, and then we're like, well, what if we delete the whole context from the repo? Like, what would happen? And what happened for us is actually like the evals started to perform like much better once we deleted the whole context, which was counterintuitive, but it's just like, that file was pretty big and was listing stuff that was not like necessarily useful or, that should not go into like a steering document.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting to see.
I love that sort of insight. It's kind of a real world manifestation of how context rots, right? And we're sort of so familiar that software rots that it goes from kind of being useful to being useless to being harmful on it. And for context, we don't have that muscle memory yet on it. So now you're seeing it with the skills. I guess what was the result of, so the insight is great. It sounds like you still ran those evals centrally because it was like you or your team is kind of thinking you'll do that. You ran the evals, you found out it's actually outperforming having context. I guess what could you do about this? Could you sort of go off and say, cool, let's delete the context? How did you handle it?
Yeah. So I think if we didn't have data to back it, it would be pretty controversial. And just like to be clear, this was owned by the front-end team that run for the front-end monorepo. They wrote eval, they did for the testing there. And like kind of they wrote new guides of like what should you do instead of context. And so like, that was fully something that like was owned by the sort of team within my org, but like not like by the AI team. And so yeah, with the data backing this decision, a lot of people were surprised by this decision, but the data was like really clear that it was performing much better. And so people agreed with it like very easily once they saw the numbers for the data. Yeah.
So I think like two sort of interesting tidbits over here is like, one is you removed the context, but it's because you have started forming a harness. So, right, you're saying this was not just because the models got better, but also because you started working with more custom harnesses.
This is something we're doing now.
Okay. So this is still primarily
led to that decision. Yeah.
Okay. So this, I guess, is sort of still primarily either the model improvements or just those context files were created at one point in time and they no longer represent reality for the agent. So anywhere between the new models don't need them and they're just wrong at this point.
Correct. Yeah. I don't think they were wrong per se, but I think it's early on. There was a lot of like basics that like he would try to retrain the agent on. Everything. Yeah. So in the case of the front end repo, there was a whole paragraph on like how to use yarn. And I'm pretty sure now it's part of the training set of like the models out there. And so, we don't necessarily need to retrain it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And context is a scarce resource. And so over time, like if you accumulate enough of that, you take away, from I saw one talk in which someone talked about how the model gets into dumb mode, because it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's.
And so in terms of governance, around context, if you want to go a bit in there, is what we saw is like actually like I think we have an incline to just go and add something for like an agent SMD, but very often it just as easy as like, is the error message from that tool clear? And do you provide the next step of like, what should you do instead? And so we've been also moving or like pushing people that like, when they run into it, like kind of an issue where the agent doesn't do what you want it to do, well, where like can we provide that context when it's necessary instead of like trying to train the agent ahead of time into how to do everything, especially within a mono repo where like there's so much going on. You just cannot provide all of the context up front, and that seems to be detrimental.
Yeah. No, very good. So I think a whole bunch of lessons from here. One is the importance of evals, so you can make data-driven decisions. Two is maybe a reminder around how context does rot over time. So you have to have some sort of plan around how would you sort of reassess it, which comes back to evals. But even if you're just vibing it, like still do something, like be proactive around updating it. And then, maybe just a little bit more as you write new context, solve problems, don't sort of anticipate them as you go, which I guess comes back to the observability and the loops, right? Because today probably the best practice is don't actually solve problems, like just sort of solve a problem in the spot and create a loop to identify and manage that context. And you, like when we spoke, you talked about how you think one of the theories of how the context got accumulated in the repo was because of this sort of loss aversion. Like, once someone wrote it, it was hard. And maybe this comes back to evals is, it just sort of feels fearful to delete it. Like maybe it is useful somewhere on it. Is that, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like as people propose to remove stuff from like that root agent MD file, like even in like PR review comments, people are like, well, are you sure that like you should be doing this? Because like maybe it provides value to somebody somewhere. And so I think, yes, it's when you remove something and you don't replace it with something new, it is just hard to do, especially when you're having an impact on like hundreds or thousands of engineers at once. Is like, it's hard to have certainty. And so like, if you don't have data to back those decisions, it is really hard to like take the step to go ahead and do it, or like feel the permission or feel that you have a good reason to do it.
Yeah. I'm 100% sort of in agreement, and it's I love to see it in manifest. So I guess like in those marketplaces that you have, in the small ones, coming back a little bit to what do you create evals for? I mean, this sort of logic will imply that whether now or soon, like, are you starting to feel that within each of these teams' marketplaces, they need to have evals for how well these skills, like for the things that are shared, like it goes to reason to say like they also need evals, because otherwise they'll have the same problem.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They will. I think like maybe one of the challenges is also just like the distribution of those skills. Does everybody have them installed when they need them? And so there's a bit of a challenge there of like making sure that people have the right tool for the task that like they want to do. And I'm not sure the way we're working today with like local agent only and like everybody's set up for their own thing. There might be limits to that eventually. And so I'm not exactly sure what is going to be the right solution going forward, but I think meta harnesses, for example, are pretty interesting to that of like, what if we have kind of a classifier and we know, well, this is touching platform A. So let's run this with an agent that has those skills pre-installed.
Yeah.
And like, if this was centralized, for example, like I think that might be able to provide a much better kind of experience where like we have a better baseline that don't rely on like tribal knowledge or like somebody having read documentation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel, I think generally like people underestimate the importance of environment definitions in evaluations. And so I think that's at least how it translates in our world. We created these like project evals versus sort of skill evals. They're actually all just the same evals, just sort of names. And the idea was the skill eval is a thing you test in isolation. And so it's a good way to sort of test if it regresses or not. So that needs to tackle that first problem, which you correctly pointed out is a bit hard, which is define what correct is, because it runs together. And then you get into the problem of like, okay, that's nice and well, but I actually have 30 skills installed when I'm running this, not one. And so does it work in that environment? And that basically gets infinite, right? Like which skills do you have at what time and how do you, and so I think environment management, like the thing that we've sort of seen extend in flexibility, but then it's also in complexity. You have to think about how to rein that in. It's just like all these definitions of how do you define the environment within something runs. And I guess they both boil down to trying to eliminate works on my machine scenario, right? Like the one is define what correct is and define the machine of like a word, like define works and define machine, and you can step out of that. So it's interesting, and it sounds like that's still sort of a work in progress. Like at the moment in practice, these little marketplaces, I don't know if little, but like team marketplaces don't tend to have evals.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Usually they don't.
Yeah. So these are fascinating conversations. We're starting to run out of time here. So maybe sort of chat a little bit about kind of open models on it. Maybe I'll sort of open models and bottlenecks. So you started by sort of talking about how the evals were useful to assess models, and you've alluded in our sort of previous conversations how today the bottleneck is very much in the review phase of it and where we work over there. So I guess maybe I'll kind of ask you a little bit of a joint question of it, which is, where are you and what are your sort of views around the review bottleneck, what to solve it, and have you tried open models on those?
So yeah, based on our evals, I think open weight model to be like fully viable, assuming the bar does not move as progress happen in the space, would be that they would need to perform about 50% better than they are today.
Okay, interesting. This is a statement even for like GLM 5.2 and like the latest, or is it like a notch below?
No, a notch below. Okay. We didn't yet run the evals on those, but we're very excited about this.
Capacity, like these dances every time.
Yeah. And the caveat being like also for the creativity of those models with like tasks that are unknown or larger tasks instead of purely the execution part of it.
Yeah.
And so we don't have signals from our evals, but we're looking at public evals to get some signal there and then getting user feedback.
Yeah. So at the moment when you run like say code reviews or these like highly repeatable processes today, you're still with the frontier models running those.
Yeah. For code review today, we are. We're having the background agents that, for example, for code review, the first one we release is like, if your CI fail, and it's like a linting error, a formatting error, stuff like that, then like that's pretty easy to offset to like an agent to just go fix it for you. So you don't need to like come back and like have to deal with it yourself. And so we're trying to like remove friction from like different places. And like a lot of those tasks can be done because by like an open weight model that is like much cheaper, because it doesn't need creativity. It's like a very clear path. Like you need to run a command, or you need to do some kind of something specific. And so our thinking now is like we probably can encode a lot of what like you would do out of Claude Code through background agents that are just going to take action on your behalf to like nudge things along. And then here's like finding the right balance between like what can we trust, and like not changing core decisions of a PR, like really more into like nitpicks and like small fixes without changing the meaning of a code change that is being proposed.
Yeah, and this is consistent. It sounds like your view is there's a whole bunch of places in which it's inarguable that the agent helped. Like, let's apply the agents in all of those places. Don't get into the argument of whether it's right or not. Like, correct. Get it into all those places in which it can do it. And clearly, there's always like a little bit of a halo. Like, you might veer a little bit into judgment, but mostly lean into the areas in which you can inarguably say, this is correct. So can the agent do it? Can it not? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. And I think it's like super practical and kind of and high impact. And it sounds like in review world, and I guess kind of in the repo world as a whole, you're just sort of looking for these surrounding annoyances to sort of resolve those. And there's so much kind of meat on that bone that you're plenty busy sort of doing that. You don't need to get into features quite yet.
Yeah. Correct.
Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Our team is working really hard behind the scenes to bring you the best guests so we can have the most informative conversations about agentic development. Whether that's talking about the latest tools, the most efficient workflows, or defining best practices. But for whatever reason, many of you have yet to subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying the podcast and want us to continue to bring you the very best content, please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really does make a difference and lets us continue to improve the quality of our guests and build an even better product for you. All right, back to the episode.
I'd love to talk a little bit about people and around sort of hiring. So I know you've had a lot of learnings about how you hire and what is it that you advocate or like expect people now when you think about promotions or kind of their career ladder. So can you share a little bit about the learnings there and like where you are today and maybe some key learnings?
Yeah. So personally, I always hated lead code type of interviews where I think like they were low signal, a way to like filter out some like candidates, but I think like very often, could just lead to like the wrong conclusion. Mm-hmm. So I've never thought that it were a nice way to hire people. I've never liked doing them personally, and I've personally always felt like it was kind of low signal basically. So I think AI opened the door to make a case to actually like review how we do interviewing, especially coding interviews. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is like we've built a few squads to own different questions, and with AI in the interview, it allows us to do much more than we could before. And so it allows us to basically work on a much larger code base and asking like actual tasks like somebody might be doing in their day-to-day and like assessing more signal than like, yes, they could write the code in like 40 minutes right. and like pass all of the tests, but more like how's their judgment, how's their trade-off? Did they understand the code? And so like with AI, basically the new flow for most of the interview is going to be like, here's a code base. It's fairly large. Use AI to understand what it's doing, right. what is going on, what is this code base about. And then afterward, like, let's like talk of an engineering problem. So like maybe you want to extend this code base. Maybe there's like a diff, like basically kind of a code review that like somebody wants to merge. What should we bring back in terms of like feedback to that code review? Yeah. And so more like kind of real world scenarios. And I think this can only happen with larger code base. And without AI, it would just not be possible to go through and understand the whole context. It's like it would be more like kind of left to luck almost. And so I think it like really allowed us to like step away from lead coding into more actual real world scenarios in the interviews.
Yeah, no, I love that it, first of all, it's closer to the reality. And there's actually like a bit of a hidden question about your sort of agent foo, like how masterful are you at kind of navigating the agent? And so you're sort of testing two things at once, your
exactly.
Sort of your depth in the agent usage and your ability to understand those. And I guess it does imply though that this is like an in-person type element. There's no, this isn't a kind of take home code review or like coding exercise. It has to be inside. And is that you just sort of accept? I guess that's a slight inefficiency in the sense that you need to talk to more people that you just take these with.
Correct.
Yeah. And how? I guess on the other side of it, like when you think about people moving up the ladder, and you think about people already in the job and doing it, what has changed in terms of what do you assess them for promotion?
Yeah. So we reviewed our career guideline this year too. And so we got together with a group to like brainstorm about like what changed in terms of expectation, or like what is more kind of important today. And so a few things to call out at the high level of like things that like we changed. One is for more junior roles. I think we saw for everybody that like we had a higher kind of expectation about like the complexity of the work that they're going to own and like kind of push forward. And so we updated, kind of those role to actually reflect like the new kind of baseline expectation of just like, you can take a whole project. You probably want some help from like somebody, probably kind of understand, asking the right questions, learning about, the sort of core competency of like being an engineer. But compared to before, which was usually somebody would be in a support role on a larger project, we're finding that like most of the time now they are owning like kind of a whole work stream by themselves because they can now. And then they just need to make sure that they're asking the right question. And so like here we changed a bit that definition for more junior roles. In terms of more senior roles, I think what we saw is like before, two things. One is in terms of like POCing and experimenting. And the second is like on like judgment. Like, should we do this? When should we stop doing something? Is this solution the right one to the problem the customer is like having? And so like there's much more of like a judgment call being done.
Yeah.
And then in terms of
product and architecture tastes, right?
Yeah. Correct. And on the POC side of things is I think before we would spend a lot of time on like documents and RFCs to talk about like, is this the right solution for that problems and all this? And I think like there's like definitely value to those questions, but I think now we can know more certainty around like, is this going to work or not if we do a POC first? And so you can validate assertion in practice by doing POC. And because it's so easy to like POC something with AI, is like you can do a few POC and like compare those options before you decide into like which one you want to actually invest in long term and like really make production ready. And so it's like we have much more of like kind of a try things first and then bring the learnings from that to make the proper decision. And so that's a bit different from before, where like you would need to think of everything because it was costly to create a POC. But today, try something, run it and see what happened, and then bring those learning back to then inform the right decision you want to do.
Yeah, no, I love that, both as a behavior and as an expectation, from people. And I often say that like now that the cost of building is lower, the relative cost of alignment is higher because it takes just as much time to get people in a room and have a conversation. And so investing and building more to reduce the cost of alignment, because by the time you align, there's like something concrete and kind of more proven, is clearly like the right trait for it. So I love those.
Yeah. And I think it helps a lot in discussion to just have something more concrete to talk about. Like you might have concern, this is not going to work. But actually, if you had it in a POC and it does work, it might prove the point that like, okay, no, this is possible actually. And so like give you a bit more certainty in your direction. So I think like it changed really the whole game in terms of like discussion of like what's the right design for a solution.
Yeah. Simon, this was excellent. It's like just jam-packed with useful advice. I was going to ask you what's your sort of single biggest lesson or takeaway, but frankly, you sort of shared a whole pile of sort of useful lessons here and learnings for it. So really, really appreciate you sharing it. I'm sure the listeners are. Instead, maybe I'll ask you like one different question, which is, what are you excited on for what's next? What are you looking forward the most?
Yeah. I'm really excited to basically like being able to make better business decision. And like, that's kind of where we ended up on, but like, that's really my belief around AI. Like, productivity is nice and all this, but it's not like really kind of a game changer. Like, but yeah, being able to know and make better decision, I think is really the key thing we are like gaining with AI. And this is like really what I hope we will see happening in the business world is like, hopefully we ship better product because we were able to try multiple things and see what works and what doesn't, instead of like maybe spending kind of a whole quarter on a project that is like off ready, then you ship it anyway because of, you've like invested all of that time. You need to show something for it. And I think that like calculus here of like what can go out and like when you can be like, this doesn't work, let's like start from scratch and do something different with the learnings we've had. I think it's much more possible today than it's been in the past. And so I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, it is super exciting. I love we did a roundtable at AI Native DevCon recently, and someone said there that it's not about increasing productivity, it's about increasing ambition. And kind of, I loved that sort of phrasing, and it sounds like that's very much what you're talking about here. So
I love it. Yeah.
Cool. Simon, this has been excellent. Thanks a lot for coming onto the show and sharing all these learnings. And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
The AI Native Dev is brought to you by Tessel, the package manager for skills and context. Your hosts are Guy Pajani and me, Simon Maple. Our producer is Tom Dowler. The AI Native Dev is not just a podcast, it's a community, and we host monthly meetups at the Tessel offices in central London. Visit tessel.io/community to learn more, and I hope to see you there.